It's important not only to support the young journalists and the junior journalists to deal with the trauma, but also to provide the editors and the managers, the CEOs about the information, how to deal not only with your own trauma, but also with the trauma of your staff or with your freelancers.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
So we're back with the second episode in our series looking at how secondary trauma can affect women who are documenting atrocity crimes and how they can deal with that.
In the first episode, we heard from journalists, lawyers, and trainers about what kind of traumatic material they have to deal with in their work life and how it has impacted them over the years and the strategies that they developed to cope with it.
Yeah, give it a listen if you haven't already. Having listened through to the material, I was really struck by how many of the women said that the most important thing they found out about secondary trauma is that it exists. There is such a thing. And then, their reactions and their understanding of it all developed from that, from understanding that this is an actual issue.
And with that in mind, we were left with quite a few questions, like what if practitioners went on for years without knowing that secondary trauma could be an issue? And what is done, if anything at all, at the institutional level to support them? And is there some kind of stigma around mental health discussions in the field of international justice? I can also imagine that if you have to deal with victims telling their stories or listening to these stories, that you're not really up for saying, hey, I am also traumatized by just hearing this, especially if you're trying to get justice for people. And we want to know if things have changed in the last decade, especially since documentation became a lot more reliant on technology. And we know that images and especially sounds hit much harder sometimes than just the written word.
Yeah, the lawyers and the journalists and the trainers that our producer Margherita Capacci had spoken to, that you heard from to start with in the first podcast and now again in this one, they had a lot to say on this. They helped also provide some expert tips on how to check whether you could be affected yourself and what to do to protect yourself. But before we start, just a note, as we'd said in the previous podcast, Margherita conducted these interviews a couple of years ago and things have moved on since then.
So before we get into all of it, it might be a good idea to get some clarity about the terminology. There's actually several things that can be going on at the same time. Let's refresh what Alexa Koning said in our previous episode. Now, Alexa is the co-faculty director of the Human Rights Center and the director of the Human Rights Center's investigation program and an adjunct professor at UC Berkeley School of Law, and you'll hear more from her later. But in the previous episode, she explained that both vicarious and secondary trauma are responses to the traumatic experience of other people. But if secondary trauma can happen from hearing about or viewing one traumatic experience that someone else has lived, vicarious trauma is more built up over time by hearing witnesses of trauma and others. Symptoms can be pretty similar, and they are also close to post-traumatic stress. So you have inability to sleep, getting nightmares. Something else we also see is burnout, which is when the stress of an experience begins to overwhelm your daily capacity to deal with obligations you are given and can lead to exhaustion and lack of motivation in the long term.
Yeah, as you'd already said, Steph, we're very well aware that secondary trauma, or even actually original trauma, is what is experienced by survivor communities, and we practitioners aren't necessarily the biggest part of the story, and we shouldn't be the main story. But this is a real issue, and we do want to look at the new, better practices which are starting to emerge to help our profession.
Yeah, so historically, trauma is not a really big part of not only not of study curricula, but also just not something journalists or lawyers are really given as a toolbox. But that awareness is developing now, and it didn't always used to be there. Also in big organizations, I know Reuters is doing a lot about it now, but they didn't when I worked for other news agencies when I started 20 years ago. That really didn't happen. But now we see more and more awareness. Reuters even has mental health days, for example. But someone who can also explain a little more about this is Maxine Marcus. You heard from her in episode 1. She has over 20 years of experience as an international criminal prosecutor and investigator, and she is the founding director of Partners in Justice International, and they provide technical support to local practitioners, partnering with them in cases to help them ensure accountability for international crimes in their own country's courts. And she looks a bit back at her past and what has changed.
There wasn't a lot of support, I will have to admit, in the institutions I was working for, but I was working for international and UN courts, right? So it's a little bit of a different context. I think our work in this field goes back a really long time. And so I would say before I became a prosecutor, when I was doing investigations, it was at a time where not only wasn't there really much talk about secondary trauma, but there weren't mechanisms in place. We were just starting to figure out how to even investigate war crimes. I'm talking about like in the 90s. And in the tribunals, so I worked at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. There was one psychologist who was serving the victims. Now, there was nothing prohibiting the staff from going to her, but there were 400 victims of, amputations and gang rapes and so which investigator or prosecutor is going to go and take her time away from the victims? It was just not a thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly what I was aware of at the beginning of the Rwanda tribunal. So we're talking about the 1990s, sort of feels like Stone Age, doesn't it? There definitely wasn't a lot of support around. I do remember one of my colleagues at the BBC really suffered severe burnout, secondary trauma from what he had experienced, what he'd actually seen on the ground. And here is also Max again explaining her experience at the ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal.
There was a staff welfare officer at the Yugoslavia Tribunal who was meant to support us. There was only one time that I can recall where he reached out, and it was because of one particularly gruesome case that traumatized pretty much everybody who touched it, including the interpreters and everybody. And we had like a group session with him or something afterwards where we realized basically collectively that we were all really messed up because of that case. So, I'm laughing, but, you have to laugh. That's part of how you get through it, right? So I'm not brushing it off. So we did meet with him once, but he was available. But it was one person, right? And we had, if you combined everybody, lawyers, investigators, and everybody working in the office of the prosecutor at the ICTY, it got to a lot of people who touched that evidence. And so I don't think that enough attention was given to it in the context of those agencies.
I've mostly worked for much less well-funded organizations.
That was Kathleen Roberts, or Kathy. She's the founding co-director of Partners in Justice International together with Max. And Kathy has represented victims and survivors of human rights violations and international atrocity crimes in courts for over 2 decades. And she experienced a lack of support when working domestically on international crimes cases when she was with the Center for Justice and Accountability, the CJA.
There was no provision of support at the Public Defender's Office in California. So it's not a surprise that when I went to work for a nonprofit, there was not a lot of support there either. I would say the difference was that although CJA was a small group of people, there was a sense of wanting to provide support to each other. As I got more seniority in the organization, and particularly when I became legal director, I made the commitments that I could, which was to bring in somebody once a year who was an expert on torture treatment and the sort of most up-to-date information about how trauma works, et cetera. I would say there was a lot of symptoms of untreated trauma in our team. including that nobody would want to come just to learn about secondary trauma and worry about themselves, always the victims and witnesses first.
So that really begs the question, doesn't it? How did people actually cope back in those days?
I used to joke that the traditional way that lawyers are trained to deal with trauma is through alcohol and drug abuse. It's a little bit of a joke, but it's also, I think, really true. I think lawyers, and maybe not especially dealing with atrocity crimes, but lawyers are asked to deal with people who are in trouble, right? Whether you're doing criminal law or civil law or divorce law, family law, like if you are working with people who are in trouble, you are likely to encounter trauma. And we typically get zero training, zero understanding, zero support.
Yeah, that joke about alcohol and drug abuse is also made a lot in journalism circles. And of course, journalists are also working kind of directly with victims, and others work as first responders or those supporting journalists on the front lines. And we talked to Mais Kat, an investigative journalist from Syria, and she's based on the Netherlands, focused on the Middle East, and she also works as a media trainer.
I was an editor of a website for 5 or 6 years during the war in Syria. What I noticed, and then later on I was reading about it, that when the correspondents or when the journalists are living inside the crisis, in danger, then they feel that they are in a survival mood, let's say. So they can deliver and they can work and they can go on because they feel that they need to do that. But many of them, at the moment that they go out of Syria and they live in a safe country, a lot of traumas started to come out. And then they have the time and the place to think about what happened. And that's why I was at the beginning, trying to contact some journalists or colleagues and asking them, for example, if they can write an articles for us. I was dealing with some people that they were not able to deliver. They say, yes, we want that and we appreciate the opportunity, but then they don't deliver. And I couldn't understand at the beginning what's going on, why people are not able to deliver the work that we are agreeing on, or they stop responding to my emails, for example. And then by time I found out that the people can be under trauma and they can be also partly burned out, or they can be, depressed. There's many different things can happen because of dealing with the secondary trauma.
Mais has really decided to develop her own knowledge about this topic more. She's used to working with colleagues in Syria, Yemen, Egypt, but she says especially in her own Middle Eastern culture, working in those areas, it's really quite hard to admit that you need psychological support.
But it's still like a kind of taboo. With my conversations with my colleagues, I always noticed that there is a big lack of knowledge. There is only training delivered to the journalists, the capacity building in so many different ways. I really think that it's important not only to support the young journalists and the junior journalists to deal with the trauma, but also to provide the editors and the managers, the CEOs, about the information, how to deal not only with your own trauma, but also with the trauma of your staff or with your freelancers.
I think especially it has to be really hard as freelancers, having to also deal with secondary trauma. And added to that, if you are yourself displaced and working as a journalist, but also kind of being a refugee. And Mais raises an important point. There are really not enough regulations to protect freelancers from losing their jobs if they cannot deliver. And so it's, they can't really show to their employers that they're having trouble with the things they cover, because then they won't be asked again.
Yeah, for some people, the way to help deal with all of this is to get some kind of specialist support. But May said that she's learnt from others that it can also make a big difference if their own editor is actually already the kind of person who is aware of the issues and can spot them and then encourage the people working for them and work together to try to deal with them. But the key caveat there is that, you know, the team needs to feel really comfortable talking about these issues together.
And that's also another thing, like building the trust and giving them the feeling that they can be open and talk about it. So I really think the empathy is the most important thing. But also, from the other hand, the pressure of work. I was an editor. And then I have a lot of pressure, time pressure, and you need to deliver. And sometimes you need to write the final article yourself instead of resending it to someone that you already know that he or she is tired. So it's not easy for everybody, but at least knowing that you can do something can make a big difference.
Yes, you make some really good points. And I have to say at Reuters now, there is also there's a peer network for journalists who are experiencing the same issues. And it's a nice halfway stop between going to a professional and not dealing with it, is that you can talk to your peers, and that makes for a lot of more understanding, and you can talk out some of the issues you have.
Yeah, we're going to talk a bit later on also about peer support, which I've never experienced in the professional context, so I'm intrigued to hear about that. But here we have Kim Bryce. She's the co-founder of The Self-Investigation, where she provides personal leadership, coaching and stress reduction and resilience training to lots of different kinds of people, including journalists. Before that, she was working as a global freedom of expression activist and as a founder and organizational advisor to many media, journalism and social justice support programs. And here she highlights what a big role employers can also play outside of the conflict zones.
If you look at the World Health Organization's definitions and others, they basically say that burnout has to do with your capacity to relate to the stressors at work, right? And what I want to say about that is, while a lot of burnout is related to our work, but it's not about necessarily your capacity not to be able to deal with work. I think we need to realize that a lot of employers are asking their staff members to do much more work than is humanly possible. And digital overload is a key issue because we are exposed to so much information at such a high speed through so many different devices that it exhausts us mentally. And burnout is to a large degree mental exhaustion. It's not actually physical exhaustion. None of us, unless you're a marathon runner and you're running marathons every day, we don't get exhausted because we're doing too much physical activity. We get exhausted because we're doing too much mental activity.
Kim told us that exhaustion due to burnout can have many different faces. It's not only when we feel really physically tired and kind of seem to get up from the couch, but it can also mean that we keep going because we are committed, but we are in fact mentally burned out and we don't really notice. So what needs to change?
Putting the onus on the person that has to learn how to cope with stress more is just not enough. Yes, of course we do. But there are work conditions that are simply not respectful of, again, that we're not human doings, we're human beings. And if we're not good at setting limits and our employer isn't, there's a real problem. And we're all different. Some of us are far more resilient than others, and that's okay. So it depends sort of, where you start. If you already have post-traumatic stress disorder or trauma-related stress in your body, this is going to impact how you deal with the day-to-day thing. Burnout is not because you start hating your job. Some people say, you're starting to get burned out because you hate your job. Not necessarily. Some people love their job and they're leaving because they're getting burnt out, not because they hate their job, but because it's becoming untenable.
I would say first that no one would ever say there's a stigma, and then also that, of course, there is in a way, Stigma to me it's a very strong word. It suggests like you're marked for life or something. And I don't know, stigma is way too strong of a term, but there is a kind of machismo in this field that I think is really common. It's kind of, I'm very tough. I don't need whatever support. We're not a bunch of victims here. We can handle it. That kind of can-do-ism that is, I think, indicative of a struggle.
Yeah, that was Kathy, who we'd heard from previously. And here's Dania Chakol, who trained to be a barrister in Canada, but she's been in the world of The Hague for the last 13 years, working for international institutions like the ICC and the International Federation for Human Rights. And she explains to us about how this issue has been working up for her here in The Hague.
And since 2023, so after this interview, Dania has started serving as the FIDH representative to the ICC, where more attention has been recently given to issues of secondary trauma of legal professionals. And we might come back to the most recent developments around that in another podcast. But here, Dania shares that previously working in Canada, she felt okay telling her boss that something was hard, and she was told to go home and take the time she needed because she was dealing with some traumatic material. But in The Hague, she said, the pressures and the responses to the issues of dealing with traumatic material have been very different.
I never have heard that mentioned once in my jobs in The Hague. It's just, I don't remember any one of my direct supervisors telling me this will be hard. Anything I've ever done. It's just do it.
And she also speaks of the stigma surrounding secondary trauma in this field of international justice.
I think in the legal, I'll speak to the legal profession because that's the field that I'm in. I think there's stigma around any mental health or, sign of vulnerability or that you're not really strong and thick-skinned and can just have resilience in the face of everything. You're supposed to just be calm and articulate, and any wavering, any emotion or crying, I think, is viewed as very negative. And I think it's changing. I think, like the International Bar Association has done a big study on mental health issues and addictions. And a lot of these problems within the profession, I think, come from our inability to be human or to let us feel.
And focusing on The Hague again, we asked her why change is happening so slowly here among these institutions compared to other places.
We are just coming together at these international bodies from all over the world. And it's so hard to create a new culture, work culture that works for everyone and new rules. In Canada, where I'm from, even though it wasn't good then, I think now it's quite advanced with issues around secondary trauma and mental health issues within the profession. But then if you're from another country where that doesn't exist, you're coming with that background and then you're all coming together. So these things take longer, I think, to develop, even though there are so many protocols and things around vicarious trauma.
Mina McCallum is the host of the Trauma Informed Lawyer podcast. Do check it out if you've got the chance. And she offers training courses on trauma-informed engagement. She worked as a lawyer and served as an adjudicator in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement claims process and as the Crown Prosecutor with the Ministry of the Attorney General in Saskatchewan. She thinks new generations are playing a big role in changing the standards.
What I'm seeing with a lot of young people right now coming into our profession and other professions, they have this idea about how mental health and wellness is a priority, and they don't hesitate to talk about it. I really think that their openness and their courage is really going to transform a lot of our professions, because this antiquated, pull up your bootstraps and be really quiet about what you're going through, that mindset is sort of fading away.
And Myrna says the ongoing change towards more awareness and more protocols and away from stigma is something that she recognizes in the field.
I think that we're at a really interesting point in how people come to their work and do the work that they do, because what I find interesting, at least happening in Canada and maybe even a little in America, is that we're seeing people in really high-level jobs starting to talk about the mental health impacts that they have experienced. I think that when we see our leaders and we see our bosses and all the people that are way, way up above us in the hierarchies of our organizations, right, talking about how mental health and wellness is a priority, disclosing how they coped poorly for years, like by abusing drugs and alcohol until they found a better way, or admitting to some of their flaws and their failures about how they became just conflict-seeking jerks as a way of coping with things that they just were not coping well with. I think until we start to see a lot more of these real stories and displays of vulnerability and humility, more people will feel comfortable to come forward and say, me too. And to also say, like, let's just remove the facade that, we're completely impervious to human suffering just because we are judges or journalists or police officers or whatever, like fill in the blank, right? We're human beings. We all have human experiences, particularly in the face of witnessing human suffering. And so I think that the more people talk about it, that's how we break down that stigma.
Alexa Koenig, who we mentioned earlier, the co-faculty director of the Human Rights Center and director of that center's investigation programs at Berkeley School of Law, says that stigma has been a barrier, but that the times are changing.
So I do think it's a growing awareness and training of all generations of investigators so that we can really learn from each other about what kinds of physical, digital, and psychological risks every type of investigation brings in, and begin to understand that it's not a weakness to need harm or to put interventions in place or even standard operating procedures into teams that will better protect people from all three risks of harm.
Alexa also explains how Berkeley has structured their trainings into holistic security and managed to include within that bit trauma training because she says, quote, if one of those begins to slip, the others are going to slip. So if you are worried that a government is tracking you online, your psychological well-being is going down. If that's accurate, your physical security may well go down, and vice versa, end quote.
The more traditional war crimes investigators had said, whenever we wanted to offer a training, I want this method and I want the digital security, we don't need the psychosocial stuff. We're really experienced and that's just not something that's going to affect us. We know our jobs. And so it was like sneaking in the vegetables with the dessert of saying, okay, we're going to reframe this as holistic security. We're not training you the digital security without the psychosocial security because they actually relate to each other. And I think that was the right move. I do find today when, for example, we lead trainings at the Institute for International Criminal Investigations and we get to the psychosocial stuff, even very experienced war crimes investigators will often come up with the break saying, I'm really struggling with this with my team. I don't know how to help and support my team. Any advice you can share on this would be extraordinary. And these are people who I think even 3 or 4 years ago probably would have pushed that away and crossed their arms and not wanted to admit that we all are human. And that ability to be human and have human empathy is what drives us to do this work in the first place.
And we also asked Alexa to explain how the huge change that we've seen in our field, that documentation over the last 20 years has been moving away from only witness-led evidence and now includes more and more open source-led evidence, and that's being led by open source specialists. I'm wondering how this new way of working is also part of why we see a change in attitudes to these issues of secondary trauma. These new types of publicly accessible evidence include the material found on social media platforms, which is a kind of rich hunting ground for investigators, but poses also different and very big kinds of challenges.
Well, we've historically had pretty decent training in physical security. One of the two of the big gaps that we've really seen is training on any form of digital security or what we call psychosocial security or wellness or resiliency. I think that when we're looking at documentation in digital spaces, the ways that information impacts you can be really different than when you are boots on the ground. In the more traditional context, you gathered a lot of strength from being part of a team, having people you could debrief with after seeing things that horrified, etc. You also really got feedback from the communities in which you were working, if they weren't your home communities, where you got to see the positive impacts of your work, hopefully. When you're dealing with digital investigations, You're often working in isolation, yourself and a computer screen, sometimes as part of a team, but it's really not played up in the same ways. You're going home to your families or your roommates, and they may not understand what it is to even do. So I think getting that sense of solidarity can be really difficult. But also, just given the speed and scale of the transmission of digital content, we're dealing with a scale of traumatic material that I think you can't find in the physical world. It may be thousands or hundreds or thousands of videos that you're combing through in any given day, trying to understand a particular atrocity that happened, particularly if it was well documented, where you may be seeing the worst of what humanity has done to each other over and over again, as opposed to more isolated acts of violence that you might be exposed to in the field. So I think given the speed, the scale, given the different relationship to digital content from physical content, we really have only a very beginning understanding of both the ways that that digital content can harm, but also how we can better protect ourselves from that harm.
And Alexa told us exactly how the Berkeley Human Rights Center started to approach the issue. They realized early on that they would be exposing their relatively young cohorts of journalists and investigators to a lot of difficult material. And that just one course on the risk of trauma would not do the trick. So they decided to provide peer support and drop-in office hours and really opportunities to talk with the trauma center and the psych center, and letting a lot of the university's own psychotherapists know about the kinds of work the students would be doing so that they would be well informed if there were referrals made or if students choose to come to the psychologist. And they also partnered with a private psychotherapist who offered free counseling. So we asked Alexa to give us some of the expert tips and tricks.
The basics of how we approach psychosocial well-being is first to advise every person doing this work to have an understanding before they launch in or at the start of an investigation of what normal functioning is for them. So even to write down in a journal, if they can take that time to how many hours a night are they sleeping on average? How many meals a day are they having? How often are they socializing with friends? And then it can become a marker, a time marker, where they might look partway through an investigation or after an investigation is concluded and see if any of that has shifted in radical ways that may suggest that the investigation and the psychosocial stress of that investigation may be impacting their daily ability to function. So I've certainly seen war crimes investigators who've had to leave their practice because they had suddenly gone from one glass of wine a night to 2 bottles a night. That's an actual example from someone that I worked with, and who was telling me she was having risky sex with strangers. Like she would, and I think it was just an attempt to really numb some of the overstimulation that you get from doing this kind of work, which can be so psychologically risky.
So understanding your baseline is step one. What's next?
So once you have kind of that understanding of what normal is for you and an ability to understand when you're beginning to slip, to also build a community around yourself. So you're not doing this work in isolation, but you at least have one partner or one small team that you can debrief with at the end of the day or at the end of an investigation. At least one other person who knows what you're exposed to so that you are not alone and you're not just internalizing everything, but that you have opportunities for outlet that would in some ways mirror what human rights practitioners have found so helpful about more traditional investigations with boots on the ground, where you are able to debrief having a beer or not a cocktail if you don't want one at the end of a day and really process what you've experienced. That sense of community is huge, and I think it's often underappreciated by the funders in this space who really should be ensuring that if they are funding some of this work, that built into that, the ability to come together as a community, to process material, to even have dinners and drinks and normal food and water is a really important part of processing and coping.
Intuitively, this all makes a lot of sense, but we're curious what the bigger principles behind this approach are.
Making sure that physically you're setting yourself up to be as healthy as possible. There's a saying among a lot of digital investigators, have you drunk your water today? Like that you're just constantly hydrating and keeping your body in a baseline good place. We all know when we get overtired or we haven't eaten and we skipped meals, how that can really affect our mental functioning or reactions to things. And so the idea is to treat our bodies like one of the tools that we're actually using as a component of the investigation.
So we also asked Alexa what precautions people need to take when actually undertaking an investigation.
In terms of the tips and tricks of the investigation itself, I think some of the most common is, of course, to minimize the exposure to the traumatic material to the extent that you can and still do your job responsibly. So there's begun to be the analogy that this is a little bit like exposure to toxic material. You shouldn't just be exposing your friends and your colleagues to the toxic material without a real need for them to be exposed to it. When you do, you need to prepare yourself and you need to prepare them for what they will be exposed to. So much like suiting up and putting on protective gear, making sure that you are doing this work at a desk and ideally not in your bed, not in some intimate space that you normally use for relaxing, but that you're putting on that professional mindset and you're going in and you're getting out and you're taking the right precautions to get the toxic material off of you when you're done.
And she gives us some practical tips on how to deal with traumatic material itself.
When you're in, I think minimizing the sound so that you are minimizing the deep emotional content that is resonant in the auditory material is incredibly critical. I personally, when I watch a graphic video for the first time, will keep the sound completely off and I will scroll through the thumbnails. So I'm also seeing the image as small as possible so that my brain can prepare for what I'm going to see if I watch the video in full screen or I turn on the audio. And I can kind of take a deep breath and I can eliminate something that researchers have found is really difficult to cope with, which is the element of surprise. I don't want myself surprised or anyone else on my team surprised by something particularly graphic or atrocious. So I think that brings us to also just the visual material. If you don't need to see something on a huge screen, don't. If you don't need it on autoplay, turn off autoplay on all of your social media feeds. So again, you minimize the risk of surprise. If you share a video with a colleague, you always want to give them a heads up. And sometimes we share videos with each other through a spreadsheet. So like we have a long list of all the videos and they might go poking around looking for one that's relevant or that they need to process for the investigation. Ideally, you're flagging which ones are particularly graphic or upsetting. And if you can, having a little column about the nature of the upsetting material, that can be quite helpful. So for example, if it is an incident of sexual violence, that you put sexual violence next to it after flagging it in red that it's graphic, or that you put beheading next to it so that people don't accidentally just click on a link and see something as horrific as a beheading without being prepared.
And what else do we need to be mindful of?
The other part of awareness is also knowing what affects you the most. So just given my own life experience, something that particularly affects me is people being surprised by gunfire. And there's something about that moment where they're like, what is that? That gets to me every time. I can, as horrific as I find videos of children being harmed, for some reason, I don't have the same psychosocial reaction to it. A colleague of mine who is a mother has a really hard time with videos harming children. So I may take the ones of the children being harmed while she may take the ones with active gunfire. And we can work more effectively as a team and minimize some of the triggers that we both experience.
In our trainings, we address what we call stress management and digital wellness. So how you can relate to digital technology, your tools, your applications in a healthier way.
Kim Bryce also talked about the practical ways to stay healthy while using technology and digital resources.
First of all, I would say it is essential. It is essential for all of us to take digital Sabbaths, meaning to get off our computers, off our phones for a substantial period of time, at least once a week. And when I mean substantial, I mean preferably a whole day, if not a half day. Look, why can people working in the digital technology industry, why are they organizing digital Sabbaths for themselves? If they're doing it, it means it's really needed.
What else can we do?
It's really taking time to disconnect. Whatever activity that allows you to let go and put aside the work that you're doing, whether it's playing with a child, whether it's taking a walk in nature, whether it's doing some movement and refueling your spirit, right? Other parts of you that don't get nurtured by your work. Really, the number one burnout prevention tool is teaching ourselves to take regular breaks throughout our day, our body craves relaxation about every 90 minutes, naturally. But that doesn't mean drinking like your 5th cup of coffee, although I'm also a coffee lover. But it's balancing that out with breaks that allow you to turn on that part of your nervous system that tells your body that everything is okay right now, that you can relax a little bit. And, for some people, that's stopping. Some people have breathing exercises they do, mini meditations, or maybe it's just taking a walk for 5 minutes around the block, or a conversation with somebody you really like. Connection with others is key.
So what really resonates with me from both what Alexa and from what Kim have been saying is this need for a team to share things with and to not be isolated and to have some kind of diversity in that team. I'd also recommend reading Alexa's book, Graphic, which she wrote together with Andrea Lampros, which has a lot of these tips on how to do all of this.
Yeah, and she also really recognizes that it really depends on your own situation, how you deal with the risks and traumas. For example, if you're in family or your mother, then you're triggered by other things than otherwise. And I know for myself that since becoming a mother, I've become much more triggered about things involving children, and very graphic detective novels that I could read before where children were harmed, I can now no longer read. And I'm sure that is the same for this kind of material.
So we do all know what the main precautions are now, but what happens if still, despite all of that, you get out of balance? We asked Alexa.
I think at that point, if you can, it's really smart to talk with a professional. There is nothing quite like a professional, and there may be times that you do need professional counseling and or even medication. The second part is giving yourself a break. I think there's nothing quite like, if you think about yourself as a runner or an athlete, if you have just gone through a marathon, your body's exhausted by the end of it. You may be one of the greatest athletes in the world, but your muscles still need time to recoup and recover. If we think of our brains as a muscle that we're utilizing in these kinds of investigations, we're also putting a lot of our emotions into it. We need some time to work on different parts of our identity and to allow those parts of our exposure to rest and to heal so that we can take the deep breath and go back in.
We really covered a lot of ground here: how to understand your natural functioning, set up a safe environment, minimize harm of online material, take regular breaks, and stay connected with your team.
Yeah, and go and talk to a therapist if needed. It's really quite overwhelming, I'm finding, even listening through to all of this material, loads to think about. Now, I know that Alexa and Kim were mainly referring to digital investigations, but so much of what they said, I think, applies to almost everyone right now. I think about work that people have to do monitoring social media, monitoring trials, and just, investigating and corroborating evidence.
Yeah, it's a lot, but it's also good to look back at the positive shift that is happening in our field and to the work that some lawyers are doing, putting the best practices in place, and have a real sense of community and a healthy culture. Here is Max again.
And I think we're working very hard. We started this organization, we're building the community, and we're working very hard on the culture. And I think that the culture that we're creating together is a much more supportive and safe environment than we have worked in the past. And it's not typical of people in this field or perhaps any other to be that intentionally vulnerable and still very powerful, which I think we all are. I think that it's one of those things about unchecked trauma is it can manifest in any number of ways in your toxic office culture. And that kind of toxicity is very hard to root out. So we're working very hard to not let it in the first place and to be sure that all of our team members are well supported. And again, it isn't the thing we spend all of our time on. We're trying to make a good office culture, is a lot more than just one that's resistant to secondary trauma, right? But I do think we have lots of space. We've made space for that. I do think just trying to do all the work all the time and deny your own humanity in the process. It's just a recipe for burnout. It's a recipe for spreading pressure and pushing all that trauma down. It's going to come out in other ways, in unexpected ways, and not in productive ways. And that will be true maybe at work, maybe at home, maybe in your life. So I don't really think there's an option. If you want to stay in this career long term or this field long term, you have to find a way to deal with that.
And Alexa says that some research is pointing to one possible positive trend, which shows that it is possible to learn how to deal with secondary trauma and then grow from it.
Secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, and burnout can have a lot of overlap in terms of how they manifest. I think one particularly interesting school of literature has been done by Martin Seligman, who has been looking a lot at militaries, particularly here in the United States, and looking at people's responses to exposure to traumatic incidents. While he's dealing mostly with the boots on the ground context, I think there's a lot that can be learned from the digital context as well, where what he's observed is that our responses to these three phenomena really can look like a bell curve, where the majority of people at the highest point will be exposed to a traumatic incident or hearing about something. They will show signs of trauma, but then they will eventually, and fairly quickly, usually in a few months, respond to some normal baseline functioning, whatever normal is for them. There is a smaller subset to the left end of that bell curve of people who will be permanently impaired by their exposure to trauma. But there are people at the other far end, the right side of the bell curve, who actually come out stronger after having been part of that, showing the different traumatic phenomena, that they come through it and they actually have greater resilience at the end. And so one of the things he's really trying to explore is how do we begin to minimize that tail end side where people are permanently harmed and maximize the other side where people actually experience something called post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, I mean, as I keep saying, I'm relatively old, been around in this field for quite some time. And I do think that experience can help because, at the end of the day, you do develop some kind of resilience and some kind of coping mechanisms.
Yeah, I think you do. I think if I listen back, some of the ways we've developed coping mechanisms is kind of by ourselves. In journalism, a lot of that is making sarcastic jokes about horrible situations, which I see a lot of fellow journalists do. There's also a lot of watching fuzzy cat pictures and feel-good things that I do and that I hear that a lot of other people do. But it's good that we now have a more kind of professional idea how you could do with this and see some of the underlying things that explain why we do what we do as coping mechanisms.
But still, this kind of big question remains, how we go forward from here. How do we make this work in the field of international criminal justice where we know that people do have to deal with traumatic material? How do we make it better organized so that people don't get burnt out and actually want to stay in this field?
To end the episode, we have Myrna, Danya, and Kim sum up the real challenges and their hope for a different culture that starts at the entry or training level and changes within institutions' practices, and how you can continue to influence day-to-day operations even in moments of extreme pressure.
I'm just thinking about the people who are struggling a lot right now who don't talk about it. Here in Canada, in America, lawyers have a high suicide rate. We have a high addiction rate, right? And I just want to say that the profession is changing, the world is changing, and we can change right along with it. And there are more and more people thinking about mental health and wellness as a priority who are talking more about their own traumatizing experiences, but also their own healing experiences. And we can bring healing into all of our professions. We can bring humanity into our work. We can bring empathy, I think, is such a superpower, as is humility. And I think that we need to start to become acquainted with those concepts and move away from whatever traditional sort of training and formal training we've received, talking more and more about how emotional intelligence is a critical competency for a lot of our roles, a lot of our work. work. I think that that's one of the ways in which we make our work sustainable, and sustainable meaning that whatever passion and purpose you come into your work with at 25, I think you should leave with that same passion and purpose when you're 55 or 65, right?
I have thought many times of leaving the profession, but not just the secondary trauma, just the overall lack of empathy. And I felt my personality just being pushed down and not being able to be myself. And that's not a good feeling but then I've had amazing experiences in some offices, like my recent job with FIDH, with people that I really clicked with, that I felt supported by. So I still have hope and I still want to try to help make it better. There's a lack of good management skills and leadership in a lot of the courts. Sorry to say, a lot of good ones too. But, when people feel empowered, respected, they have space to talk about their emotions, they can be sad, they can be happy, they can express their ideas. Oh my gosh. The productivity also dramatically increases. People have loyalty. They want to improve the quality of their work. They want to come to work. So the efficiency, the productivity, everything goes up. It's well documented. So for me, it's illogical that these tough decisions aren't made, because in fact, they're not tough decisions. If you make your staff feel safe and heard and supported, they're going to do a better job for you. And that's about being really human and real. And I think that's missing in the legal profession. So it's coming. A lot of us came into this field, in international justice and accountability and supporting victims and fair trial rights for accused, because we really have a background in human rights and we really want to make a difference. So we don't want it to get lost in this processes that are not supporting us as people.
So the stake in the long term, and I'm seeing it in journalism, is that good journalists are leaving the profession. And I add unnecessarily, perhaps, because they were not aware of what the ramifications of working at the pace they were working would have, because they didn't know how to help themselves, or maybe because they were completely resistant to acknowledging how they're really feeling. So the risk is that people are going to leave this very important profession, whether it's journalism, whether it's, human rights law, human rights activism, unnecessarily. And this is going to overall harm. We can start with the profession, but let's look at the bigger picture. Why are we doing this? To create a healthier, more balanced, just world. And this is what is at stake.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.